Hi, everybody. So today what we're going to talk about is the US election process and hopefully provide a little bit of insight as to how that happens and what are the mechanics that lead to an eventual outcome. So we're going to spend the next 10 to 15 minutes talking about the presidential election. I'll explain what other components of the election are important. I'll try and chat around what are the different strategies that the Republican and the Democratic Party use in order to try and get elected. We'll have a look at what the current polling says as to who's likely to win the election, and then we'll finish off having a look at the differences in policies between Trump and Biden and how that might impact the markets. In order to do that, I'm going to use a couple of charts. I've literally got 6 charts. I'm hoping they make some degree of sense. So we'll go through them, I think, fairly quickly. I think they're fairly evident. All right, so let's start off with who gets elected. The election is on the 3rd of November, and sitting in South Africa, we'd be acutely aware that this is the presidential election. What we need to be mindful of is that when people go out and vote on the 3rd of November, they're not just voting for the president and the vice president. They'll also be electing Congress. Now, Congress is the equivalent in South Africa of our parliament. So in effect, they will be voting for the members of parliament as well as for the president and the vice president. Now, Congress, or their parliament, is comprised of 2 different groups. The one group is called the Senate. They're the more powerful component. They represent 100 people. At this stage, they are governed by the Republican Party, or they're more Republican members within those 100 senators. And so they have quite a big influence on what gets decided within the US government. The House of Representatives is a much bigger grouping, where you've got over 400 people. At the moment, that is governed by the Democratic Party. Now, under ideal circumstances, if you become the president of the US, what you ideally want is that your political party governs both the Senate and the House of Representatives. If you find yourself in that position, then obviously you become very powerful because it's easy to pass laws, nobody's going to object, and anything that you really come up with, you can generally get Congress to approve within a fairly short period of time and start to get that implemented. If you look back at when Obama was president, he didn't have Congress on his side. So then you had Congress dominated by the Republican Party. And even though Obama wanted to do things, every time he went to Congress and asked for them to approve something, they simply rejected it because they represented the Republican Party. And that makes being a president incredibly difficult. At the moment, President Trump has a split. He's in charge of the Senate, or the Republicans are in charge of the Senate. The House of Representatives are the Democratic Party. And so he can't get entirely everything that he wants his way. But he does have quite a lot of influence because the Senate is supportive of him being representative of the Republican Party. Now, when it comes to this election, who gets elected? We elect the president, but we also elect the House of Representatives and a portion of the Senate. So let's look at the House of Representatives. 435 members. And if you get elected there, you stand for re-election every 2 years. Now, in South Africa, when we have parliamentary elections, you are effectively elected for 5 years. You become a member of parliament for the next 5 years. In the US, you have that job for 2 years. And every 2 years, you have to go back out there and try and get re-elected. That you get actually quite a lot of turnover amongst those members. Those 435 members change quite a bit because obviously not everybody gets re-elected. There are some requirements in order to be a member of the House of Representatives. You've got to be 25 years or older. You've got to be a US citizen for the last 7 years. Not a huge requirement, but it does give you some idea of what the yardstick is in order to become a member of the House of Representatives. So part of this election is to re-elect those 435 people. The Senate has 100 members, but if you have a look at the chart, once you become a senator, you are in that job for the next 6 years. So that's actually ideal. And if you just get elected twice as a senator, you've got a job, a very good job for the next 12 years. And that puts you in a very powerful position. Now, part of the Senate also stands for election on the 3rd of November. What they do is they take those 100 senators and they divide them into thirds. So every 2 years, a third of those senators stand for re-election. So you can get a change in which political party controls the Senate. Now, in order to be a senator, you've got to be 30 years or older, and you've got to be a US citizen for 9 years. When it comes to the president, if you're thinking about being the US president in the future, you have to be born in the United States in order to be the president. You can't simply immigrate there. That's not allowed in terms of the rules. You have to live there for at least the last 14 years. So it's not as if you can be born in the US but live somewhere else. You have to live in the US for 14 years, and you've got to be 35 years or older. So the US is never going to elect a really young president, a 30-year-old president. Setting the age at that level, which was done a long time ago, gives you some sense that you are going to end up electing somebody a little bit older. And as it turns out, most of the people that run for the presidential elections are significantly older than 35. So this election on the 3rd of November is not just about the president. It's about who controls Congress, who controls the Senate, who controls the House of Representatives. And the Democrats at this stage would be hoping that they control the whole lot. And therefore, they can start to have a huge influence on how the US performs over the next 4 years. Now, when it comes specifically to the presidential election, there's an oddity about the US, and it's called the Electoral College, And it's very difficult to get your mind around because it's not that logical, but it's the way they've done it always. So what happens is that when you go and vote in the US, you vote in the state in which you live. And in your mind, obviously, you think you're voting for the president. But in reality, you are voting for somebody called an elector. And depending on who wins that state, those electors then ultimately decide who becomes president. Sounds bizarre, but that's the way it's always worked. So what happens is that each state in the United States is allocated a certain number of electors. So let's use an example. Go to California on the left-hand side of the chart, 55 electors. So if the Republican Party or the Democratic Party win the largest number of votes in California, then they can allocate 55 electors to what is called the Electoral College. The Electoral College has a total of 538 people. So how does this work practically? Before you get to the presidential election, each political party nominates 538 people to be possible electors. These people are typically long-standing members of the political party. They live in various states around the US. They are loyal to that political party, and they stand as an elector. So the Democrats and the Republicans have in the background these 538 electors. And what they want to do is get as many of those electors, many of those people, into the Electoral College as possible. And how do you get your people into the Electoral College? Well, you've got to win each state. So if you win the vote in California, you get 55 seats in the Electoral College. Now, do they allocate those 55 seats in proportion to the victory you got? In other words, if you win 60% of the votes, do you get 60% of the 55 seats? No, it's a winner take all. So if you win the California vote by one vote, you get all 55 seats. So it means that you need to focus on the states that you can win, even if just marginally, in order to collect all of those electoral college seats. And that ultimately gives you the ability to become president. So after the election has happened, each state then tallies up how many people voted for the political parties. The winning vote gets all of those electoral seats. So some of the states you can see on the chart, they're very small. They only represent 3 electoral college seats, in which case it doesn't make a big difference to the outcome, and perhaps you're not going to spend that much time campaigning in that state, because if you lose the state, you're only losing 3 seats. But if you look at a state like Texas, down at the bottom, Texas, 38 electoral college seats. You want to win Texas, because that gives you 38 people out of the 538. You want to win Florida. That gives you 29 people. So there are a couple of key states that can make quite a big difference to this. So once you have the election concluded, we know which political party won each state. We know how many people they can put into the electoral college. That electoral college, those 538 people, then actually meet in December and vote on who's going to be president. Sounds bizarre, eh? They meet in December. Obviously, what happens in reality is they simply vote in accordance to their political party that they belong to, and so you don't get a surprise. You had many decades ago, you did have surprises with this process, but nowadays, the people that are part of the electoral college simply vote for the party they belong to, and therefore you are assured of victory if you've got enough seats within the electoral college. But just be aware that in the background, you've got this electoral college process, and it's about winning as many states individually as you can to build up as many electoral seats as you can, with the critical number being 270. So what each political party does is they look at this map and they say to themselves, which of these states can we win? Which states are we not going to win? Now, how do they work that out? Well, if you look at over the last 4 elections, there are a certain number of states that have either always voted Democrats or always voted Republican, no matter who is standing to be president. So take California, 55. For the last 4 elections, California has always voted Democrat. Therefore, the Republican Party knows, look, is it really worthwhile campaigning in California? And the answer, not really. You're going to lose that seat. It's going to always be a Democrat vote. And you're going to lose all 55 of those seats. Therefore, let's not spend a huge amount of time in California. That becomes your strategy. Equally, if you're a Republican Party and you look at maybe Arizona, another state, you might say to yourself, well, we always win Arizona. So let's not worry about Arizona too much because we always win it. And therefore, we're not going to spend a huge amount of time campaigning in Arizona because we're fairly assured of victory. These guys always vote Republican no matter what. So the map tells you that the vast majority of states in the US, you already know at the outset how they are likely to vote. So what are the brown states, the states that I've got there in a browny gray color? What are those states? Those end up being what you call the swing states or the battleground states. Those tend to be states that over the years can go either way. They're sometimes Democrat, they're sometimes Republican. And that is where they spend most of their time campaigning, because those are the states that you can potentially win and therefore be assured of a victory. As it stands, if you win what you normally win, you're not going to be president no matter which party you belong to. So what you've got to do is win the states that you typically would win. So take the red states, they need to win all of those they would typically win, and then see how many of the brown colored ones they can win, and they need to win as many of those as possible in order to be president. And so that's where the focus is, that's where the analysis is, that's where the discussion is. Who can win these swing states or these battleground states? And the other states, unfortunately, get no attention because people assume that they're going to vote in a particular way. Now, every now and again, you get surprises, right? Every now and again, when you go back to where Ronald Reagan was elected, he managed to win the vote in every single state except one. And so he had an absolutely resounding victory. So you do get surprises if you get a particularly popular president standing. But right now, the expectation is that there are a couple of states in the US that can make the difference. And so that's where the focus is. What is the polling suggesting? Overwhelmingly in favor of Biden. If you look at a website called 538, literally type in 538, it's a good analysis of what's happening in the US. And their model is suggesting that Joe Biden has an 83% chance of victory, which is a huge percentage. And what it suggests in terms of polling, that is in the last few weeks, the last month or so, that Biden has gained support. The feeling is the way in which Trump has handled the COVID-19 crisis has been bad. And so you've had more support going for Joe Biden. The way in which he has handled his own infection, that has been bad. The performance of the economy has hurt Trump in recent months. And so there are a range of factors that seem to be supporting Biden. And in the polling, he is the overwhelming favorite. Now, when you go back to when Trump won the election, Hillary Clinton was also the favorite, yet she lost. So what causes that to happen? Well, it's particularly peculiar around the Republican Party and particularly peculiar around Trump. And the reason is there are many people in the US who don't want to admit that they support Trump. They don't want to be seen as a Trump supporter. So when you ask them a question, they deny supporting Trump. They don't want to be seen as having the same characteristics of Trump. And so the polling tends to then skew in favor of the Democratic Party. But when it comes to the actual vote, many of those people then reveal what they really feel and vote for the Republican, or in this case, the Trump party. So while the polling is saying an overwhelming support for Biden, we've got to be careful that when you actually put in the cross on the piece of paper, you may not reflect what you said to the pollsters when they phoned you. So there's still this degree of uncertainty. Lastly, what is the difference between Biden and Trump in terms of policy? There are a couple of key differences. There's a whole lot of words on the charts. I'm not going to go through them in detail. Firstly, Biden is going to raise taxes. He's made that unbelievably clear. Trump, when he got elected, he lowered taxes. He lowered particularly the corporate tax from 35% to 21%. He also lowered the tax rate for the top income earner. And Biden has said is that he's going to reverse some of those tax reductions. Not fully, but he's going to reverse them. Now, what we don't know is how quickly is he willing to reverse that? The economy in the US is still trying to recover. Does he do that reversal very quickly? Unlikely, because it would cause some damage. So he may take some time waiting for the economy to be stronger before he increases taxes. But you can bet that he's going to up taxes and that he's going to increase them on corporates. And ultimately, the equity market is not going to like that. That undermines earnings, and that expectation is already built in. In terms of the relationship with China, it'll change. Remember, Trump has been very antagonistic to China, and I think that's been negative for the world economy. Biden will be slightly more positive, but he's not going to go easy on China because he realizes there's broad support for pushing back against China. So he will continue on with this fight against China, but he will do it in a different way. And the way I think he will try and do it is by getting other countries to support him in negotiating a better trade deal. So he'll broaden out the trade dispute, not just make it between the US and China. That takes time, and therefore I think it will result in an easier feel about the trade relationship rather than what Trump had. You're going to see Biden take on the technology sector, and in effect, there's no difference between him and Trump in this regard. The feeling is that the large IT companies have become too big, they've become too influential, they've started to eat into the privacy of people's information, and there's a lot of ground support for pegging back the IT companies and their ability through social media and other things to influence their households, etc. So I think you're going to see, no matter who wins the election, further pushback on the big IT companies. The other big difference is towards the bottom of the chart, infrastructure. Biden is setting aside $2 trillion in order to do a more comprehensive infrastructure plan. He plans on getting that $2 trillion from the increase in the taxes. And that infrastructure is going to focus on energy efficient, on green energy. So he's got an environmental aspect to his policy plan, whereas Trump spoke about infrastructure but never really got it done. And I think that is giving Biden quite a lot of support, because there's a lot of interest and a lot of appeal around that $2 trillion investment plan. So overall, you would conclude that Biden is likely to win this, that it's likely or possible that the Democrats will govern the US Congress. They already have the House of Representatives that will stay. They have a good chance of winning the Senate, in which case we may enter an era where the Democratic Party has a lot of influence. That will see the rise of socialism within the US, the rise of taxes, some changes to healthcare systems that Trump was trying to dismantle. You'll see a reversal of that dismantling process. Generally, it's not good for financial markets. The markets tend to like more of a Republican type presidency, although there were aspects to Trump's presidency that obviously were not favorable. So I think the markets will be anxious by a Biden victory, but Biden doesn't represent a radical socialist. He's not Bernie Sanders. He's not Elizabeth Warren. He's a more moderate socialist, more centrist, and therefore I think you'll see the changes at the margin. He's perhaps not all that dynamic, so you'll probably get into a fair degree of consistency, a degree of complacency, ultimately, an environment that is not all that dynamic, not all that exciting perhaps, but a little bit more steady than what you've seen out of the Trump administration. So my feeling is it's net negative for the markets, but over the longer term, hopefully it puts the US and by implication the world economy in better shape. Hope that makes some sense. Please, the charts are available and we'll monitor and see how this evolves over the coming weeks. Thank you.